So I was very surprised last Saturday to find myself reading a document called Industrial Policy of Iceland, Growth Plan to 2023. I was very surprised in particular because it reminded me that in 2003 I gave a talk in Iceland on industrial policy in which I was rather favorable to the idea of industrial policy, and my talk was not well received. I particularly remember that there was a grumpy, somewhat elderly ex-IMF Icelandic man, Jonas Haralds, who was quite disapproving of my argument. Remember, he had spent his life much of his life in the IMF. But so against that background of 2003, I was really surprised to see that the Prime Minister's office had issued on the Friday the very first Icelandic industrial policy. Next slide. And the larger point is that for more than 40 years, the very term the very term industrial policy has been outside of what is known as the window of discourse. It's also called the Overton window in honor of Joseph Overton, an American political scientist who studied the way that ideas came in and out of acceptance to be discussed. So the Overton window, or the window of discourse, refers to ideas which at any one time are able to be discussed, accepted to be discussed amongst the general public, amongst intellectual elites, amongst political leaders. And then there's a whole set of ideas which on the margins, or to use another analogy, ideas which are bad currency in terms of money, rather than good currency. But those ideas may come back, ideas which at one time are in bad currency may come back into good currency, or ideas outside the window of discourse may come into the window of discourse. And what we are seeing today, not just in Iceland, but on a much larger scale, is that what was previously forbidden is now back in the window of discourse. And the fact that it was outside for 40 plus years reflects the dominance of the wider neoliberal zeitgeist or worldview or ideology amongst mainstream economists and amongst Western political leaders. Next slide. So I'll just give you a little background of where I'm coming from in this whole debate. I did very detailed, long-term field work in India, in South Korea, in Taiwan, in which I was particularly studying the way that government bureaucracies operated, and both in terms of their internal organization and in terms of their relationship with the public that they were meant to be providing public services to. So the internal organization and the relations between the bureaucracy and the wider public, and that was particularly to do with South Korea and Taiwan. And my conclusion was that Taiwan and South Korea had used industrial policy effectively, and I wrote a book called Governing the Market, published in 1990 and republished later. And then after my field work in India, South Korea and Taiwan, I worked as an economist in the World Bank in Washington for several years in the mid-1980s and again in the late 1990s. And at that time I found that the very words industrial policy were forbidden words. They were toxic. My colleagues, even in the trade policy division of the World Bank, where I was working for a time, they did not want to talk about industrial policy, and they would dismiss it with lines like, "We know governments can't pick winners. End of conversation. We know that all governments are predatory. All governments are predatory." These are the kind of memes that they would use to just close down discussion. It was almost a visceral reaction where this phrase, industrial policy, was kind of viscerally to be rejected, somehow or other threatening. And that reflects this wider dominance in the World Bank and the IMF, elsewhere, of the neoliberal zeitgeist. And I went back to the bank in 2022, the same thing. People didn't want to talk about industrial policy. There was a small group of economists in the bank who were interested in industrial policy, but they did not use that phrase. They had a phrase like cooperative partnership policy. That was their code word for industrial policy. They weren't able to use the phrase, even in 2022. And just in parenthesis, just to emphasize the Vatican-like homogeneity of World Bank thinking, right up until Wolfensohn was president of the World Bank, in the late 1990s, the chief legal counsel of the World Bank declared that nobody, in no publication in the World Bank, was allowed to use the word corruption in a World Bank publication, even a working paper of the World Bank. You were not allowed to use the word corruption, said the chief legal counsel. Then Wolfensohn reversed that in the late 1990s. Also in the IMF, when I gave some lectures in the IMF in 2019 and again in 2022, and I spent several days in the IMF talking to people, and it was the same. Industrial policy forbidden. Next slide. Okay, and in the US, as you know, people have just rejected calling any of the many interventions, many industrial policy interventions of the US government, but they've resisted calling those interventions industrial policy. Next one. Well, then there's been a revolution in quotation marks, because quite suddenly in the past few years, industrial policy has come back within the window of discourse. It's returned to good currency. And of course that does not mean that it is accepted, but at least it becomes something that you can talk about and have controversy about. Previously you couldn't even have controversy about it. Next slide. And so this is just an example of what I mean by the return to the window of discourse. This is Andy Haldane, ex-chief economist of the Bank of England. Recently in the Financial Times, industrial strategies are all the rage around the world, which is a very striking statement. And he goes on to say, the prompt for this newfound passion has been, one, the combination of number one, lackluster growth in many Western economies. Number two, the apparent success of such strategies in stimulating growth in much of Asia. Well, you can see immediately something is missing from this list of the causes of the return of industrial strategy. Next one. So I just give you some illustration of how it has returned to good currency. This is the IMF. World Economic Outlook 2025, Chapter 23, boom, industrial policy. This is the first time the IMF has ever published anything on industrial policy, the first time it has engaged with this issue. And the conclusion of this Chapter 3 begins, industrial policy has returned to the center of the policy debate. So that's the IMF. The World Bank, 2026, just a few months ago, released an almost 300-page report, Industrial Policy for Development Approaches in the 21st Century. And again, this is the first time the World Bank has ever published a document about industrial policy. And this big shift in thinking can be summarized as a shift from the why question, that is, why do industrial policy, with the answer always being don't do industrial policy because we know governments can't pick winners, because all governments are predatory, there's always corruption, and so on. to the question how to do industrial policy well rather than do it badly, because there are high risks with industrial policy, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't even talk about how to do it well. So it's a shift from the why question to the how to do it question. Next slide. And just, so this is IMF data, and it shows this on this scale, the number of new interventions per year, which are called industrial policy interventions. And you can see, there were about 1,000 in 2009, and then another more than 1,000 in 2010, and so on and so on. And you can see the increase up to 2022. And then the next slide. And this one is from a recent EBRD publication, and it shows the rise in the total number, not the new, each year, the new number of interventions, but rather industrial policies, but simply the total number on this scale. And so these are, this is the United States. This line is the United States, this line is other advanced economies, and this line, very dramatically, is China. The total number, this shows the total number of industrial policies identified by this group of people in the EBRD, going from 2010 to 2022, and then developing countries and Eastern Europe are down here. So they're increasing too, but much less than the other advanced economies and the United States and China. Next slide. And so one of the points to notice about that is that industrial policy interventions were increasing, and increasing quite fast, long before industrial policy came back into the window of discourse, where it became legitimate. Okay, so just in parentheses, I have to clarify the terminological problem with industrial policy, because it doesn't only refer to policies to promote industry. It could be used for policy, selective policies to promote, for example, agriculture or tourism. But the key characteristic is that the policies are sector selective, possibly even firm or subsector selective, as distinct from horizontal, which apply to all firms, such as, for example, deregulation or lowering business taxation or something like that across the board. Of course, the distinction between vertical, sector selective, and horizontal gets fuzzy at the margins, but there is a distinction to be made. So, for example, what is not part of industrial policy are tariffs, which vary between products, yes, but they are intended to raise revenue rather than to promote upgrading or import substitution. And so, again, not part of industrial policy, a horizontal policy. We do have a terminological problem, and better phrases for what we mean would be sector selective policies, or directional thrust policies, or technology and productivity policy, or simply upgrading policy. Next slide. So I just want to run over what the bank and the fund, and they think very similarly about industrial policy now. What the sort of the big conclusions that they come to. First conclusion is that industrial policy can only be justified when a market failure has been identified. And so if the government cannot identify a market failure to which the policy will be directed, there's no case for industrial policy. So you can see immediately, just from that one point, this is a very, very cautious, conservative approach to industrial policy. There's no sense here of industrial policy to make markets, to steer markets. It's just market failure in a kind of very neoclassical sense. And the second conclusion, structural policies, basically meaning horizontal policies, not sector selective, can often bring higher gains even for the targeted sector. So instead of industrial policy, governments may be better off using horizontal policies even to promote sectors that they wish to target instead of the targeted policies. And then they back this up with empirical evidence across many, many countries using industrial policy. And they say, first of all, that the empirical evidence shows that targeted sectors can show better economic outcomes than without industrial policy. So they're admitting that industrial policy can work to provide better economic outcomes in the targeted sectors than would have happened without the industrial policy. That's point number one. Point number two is that the net gains from this targeting are small. And the third point is that larger gains can often come from structural reforms to improve the overall business environment and better enable credit access for all firms. And that's a quotation mark from the IMF conclusions. So you can see that the IMF is saying, yes, we are now prepared to talk about industrial policy in a how, as a how issue, how question, but the answers they give are extremely restraining. And basically the World Bank comes to much the same conclusions. Next slide. Okay, let's go on, because I've really covered this. I'm just summarizing the IMF, an IMF statement. One of the problems with these IMF findings, but the problems also with the World Bank findings, is that the findings on the effects of industrial policy are averages across a large number of countries, and so no account is taken of differences in production structures, difference in state capacity, and so on. They're just averages. And that may reflect the fact that they find that the gains from the use of industrial policy are small. Next one. Okay, so what I want to talk about now is some work on the political economy approach to industrial policy. And the starting point of political economy work is this, that industrial policy has concentrated and immediate benefits with identifiable beneficiaries, and on the other hand it has diffuse costs across taxpayers with long-term societal benefits, not immediate societal benefits but long-term societal benefits. So you know just from this a number of things. You can make a number of predictions. First of all, that government leaders have incentives to use industrial policy for political objectives more than economic objectives, such as future growth. That's one. And the second one, private firms have incentives to capture investment industrial policy funds and use the funds as rents, as profits, but not to finance upgrading. So this illustrates the risks, some of the basic risks of using industrial policy. And by the way, environmental policy tends to have the opposite effects, incentive mechanisms as industrial policy. It has diffuse and long-term benefits, like less air pollution, but it has concentrated and immediate payers, like, for example, a carbon tax. Next one. Okay, so let me elaborate a bit more on the twin risks, because although I'm rather keen on discussing how to do industrial policy well, I'm also very well aware of the risks of industrial policy, and I put it in terms of twin risks. Risk number one is that a powerful, cohesive, centralized state dominates private actors, dominates relatively weak private actors. And in this case, in this type of power balance between the state and private actors, then the state may focus on large, visible projects, on clientelistic policies, to the exclusion of effective upgrading. The state just decides, without listening to the private sector, without getting feedback, what the state and its economists think should be done. And so this powerful state may elicit little buy-in to the industrial policy projects. This was India in the Indira Gandhi, 2 decades of Indira Gandhi's rule in India. This applies. But the second risk is equally important, and it refers to the case where there's an opposite power imbalance, namely concentrated private actors dominate a weak state, where the state gives public funds, industrial policy funds, while in effect allowing the private actors to treat the funds as rents to the exclusion of effective upgrading. So these are the twin risks that, as I see it, and you will be wondering which category Iceland fits into. Yeah. So the argument then is that industrial policy is more likely to be effective when there is a balance or a matching degree of cohesion or centralization or power between the state and the private actors. And one expression of this sense of balance relates to the national level. For example, in Japan, MITI, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, was a very powerful industrial policy ministry in Japan, and it was bargaining with Kaidandran. And Kaidandran was a very powerful association of the big industrial firms. So there was relative balance between the state and the private sector in Japan through the fast growth years. Similarly, in South Korea, the Economic Planning Board, Korean Development Institute, was bargaining with the Federation of Korean Industries. There was similarly a power balance between these two sides. And that's at the national level. But it's also possible for there to be a balance at a much more decentralized level. For example, in the United States, we have a very powerful industrial policy agency, namely DARPA, which is engaged with well-organized, but not nationally organized, but at a sector level organized associations of private firms in certain specific sectors that DARPA is trying to encourage. But the private firms are well organized in that particular sector, and so DARPA and the particular sectors that it's dealing with interact in a balanced power position, rather than one where, for example, DARPA is very powerful and deciding what shall be done, and the private sector is weak. So this is these are the two levels: the national level and the sector level. They can be balanced at either or both levels. And so I mentioned that in the case of Japan and Korea and Taiwan, the balance was at the national level, but in the United States, the balance has been at a much more disaggregated level, but still balanced. And in either circumstance, industrial policy is likely to be effective. That's the argument. Next slide. So this raises then the question, how do we measure these things? The degree of cohesion or centralization of the state, for example, that is a key variable in this argument. And the argument goes that a state is more cohesive, more centralized, more powerful when there are fewer veto players who must agree to changes or fewer veto points. And then on the other hand, the state is more fragmented, it's less centralized, it's less powerful when there are multiple access points through which privates can influence and block policy. I hope you're thinking about how Iceland applies here. And then on the other hand, as I was just saying, we can measure these two things at both the national level but also at the sector level, because there may not be much contact between big industrial policy agencies like MITI in Japan and big associations of industries, also like in Japan, but there can be this balance at subsector levels, as in the case of DARPA and various other, or the National Institutes of Health or NASA, and these more decentralized agencies in the United States. Go ahead. And then, so the next question, how do we measure the degree of cohesion or centralization or the power of private interest groups? Private interests are more cohesive, more powerful when, number one, there's a single group representing the sector. Number two, this group represents a large part of the members of the sector. Maybe think of the fisheries industry here. Number three, the executive of this group can determine the group's bargaining position and impose that position on the membership, or else the membership is already united on the bargaining position. And then finally, the cohesion of private interest groups may be high at the national level, meaning strong peak business associations, such as Kaidanren in Japan, or low at the national level, but high in some specific sectors. So this again is the case of the United States. Next one. Okay, so just really to underline what I've been saying, the argument is that industrial policy is more likely to be successful when there's a balance of power in state-private coalitions or networks, or when coalitions or networks link industrial policy agencies with business associations, with universities, with think tanks, with trade unions, agricultural unions, who come together to support a cooperative approach to industrial policy nationally or in specific sectors, not nationally but just in specific sectors. So this is to make the point that networks, that the nature of the network or coalition relationship is absolutely fundamental to the effects of industrial policy. Next one. So all this can be put together in a simple 2x2 matrix where the state is either centralized or decentralized, fragmentary, or not centralized, and privates are either centralized or not centralized. And so where there is the combination of centralized privates and centralized state, you have a corporatist context for industrial policy, and this would be Japan, this would be Korea, this would be Taiwan, this would be the Northeast Asian cases, where you have the state not centralized, privates not centralized. You have a pluralist combination. This would be the United States, where you have privates centralized and the state not centralized, not powerful. You have capture, and then you have the other combination where you have let's see, just a second. Yes, you have the state centralized and privates not centralized, and this would be India for much of Indian history. Just so this is the way that it plays out. And the question again for you is, where is Iceland in this matrix? Next one. Okay, next one. So I want to finish by talking about why my title is The Uncertain Return of Industrial Policy, because I'm by no means convinced that in another 10 years industrial policy will still be within the window of discourse. So I want to talk first of all about the forces against industrial policy, all the forces that were very much in action, keeping industrial policy, even the phrase itself, out of the World Bank, out of the IMF, out of Western aid agencies. And the first point, obviously, I've talked about, industrial policy is risky. It's likely to be the flashpoint for political conflict. And I underlined the twin risks of industrial policy. Next one. Going on, a leading or pilot agency with real power is essential to implement effective industrial policy, but it's also very difficult to organize this type of structure. I'll just elaborate this point because it's fundamental, and I'm really curious to know whether there's any impetus, any thinking in Iceland about how to do this, how to create a leading or pilot agency. Sectors have different requirements for upgrading, and industrial policies must be tailored to these different requirements. Number one, many requirements are a priori unknown, and they change over time. And so the job of the agency is to learn by doing. That is to accumulate context-specific knowledge. Much of this knowledge is tacit. It's learning by doing, based on experimentation and feedback. And then the high-level agency must coordinate ministries, must monitor their actions, must hold them to account, and do the same with respect to firms and sectors, and especially this, cut off support when it's appropriate to cut off support, say because there's evidence that the firms are using the funds simply as rents and not for upgrading. There has to be a very robust accountability mechanism. And so it's worth thinking about the creation of this leading or pilot agency as something in line, or rather similar to the central bank. For example, the independent central bank, or something like NASA or the National Institutes of Health in the US. And it should not only have their kind of autonomy from the political process, but it also has to, and this is really important, build networks with firms and public agencies and unions. And this is something, building networks requires active, constant involvement, because otherwise networks will simply fail. Next one. And then the third anti-industrial policy force is the continuing power of the neoliberal zeitgeist and the way that it is embedded in economic institutions. And that it just in itself raises the probability that all these ideas will be pushed out of the window in the foreseeable future with phrases like government, we know government cannot pick winners. Okay, go ahead. Now, but there are forces in favor. One of them is the slow growth in OECD countries. Second one, China's export surge since 2001 has knocked out industries and industrial employment across the OECD. And I'm very struck by this finding. And the Federal Reserve in 2016 found that 46% of American adults say that they could not meet an emergency spending of $400 without borrowing or selling. That is, their savings are so limited that they would either have to borrow or sell. And of course, this feeds directly into Donald Trump. This was in 2016. He was elected in 2016. And then thirdly, pro-industrial policy. The US is in intense competition with China, and so finally the boundary has been crossed where industrial policy becomes legitimate in the United States. And as you know, under Biden and then Trump is messing everything around, including industrial policy. But it's quite likely that the next president will revert to Biden-type industrial policy. Yes. And so again, pro-industrial policy. We're living, as you know, in very high levels of geoeconomic tensions, which raise the incentives on governments to undertake industrial policy for national security reasons. Remember that the person who led Biden's big push into industrial policy was not the Treasury Secretary, not the Commerce Secretary, it was the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. He was the one leading the US push into industrial policy. And just to underline this point, I would remind you of Mark Carney's talk in Davos in January. Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. And this is another quote from Chris Miller, who was the author of The Chip Wars, very important book. Beijing, Brussels, and Washington are all searching for the most efficient, most asymmetrical ways to gum up their adversaries' supply chains. Also, obviously, any government, including the government of Iceland, has to consider how it is to respond to these kind of tensions and the weapons that are being used to conduct this very confrontational set of relations between states. Next one. Next one. Okay, so let me just say something about Iceland's industrial policy. I imagine that you know this, but the action plan lists 35 measures, and it lists the 10 ministries that are assigned responsibility for implementing the 35 measures. And coordination will be vested in the Prime Minister's office, which is important because it means that it's at a very high level in the political system. And then there's an independent council of 5 experts, whom I think you, Goolsby, are one. Is that right? Yeah. And then that's the first point. Second point, the growth plan and the action plan, they give the vision, they give the goals, but they're not strategy, because they don't say much about how to reach those goals. There's almost no reference to financing, how all this is to be financed. There's almost no mention of policy tools. There is no mention of a pilot agency. There's almost the only thing about the organization of this whole thrust is contained here with the 10 ministries and the 5, independent council of 5. And also, very importantly, there's no reference to how the private sector, such as unions, business associations, will be involved in this whole enterprise. So these 2 documents give a very general account of what is to be done. And that, yeah, okay. So that's the end of my talk. I would be interested to hear what you have to say, not just to me, but to each other, especially about Iceland's big push. I do find it an extraordinary rhetorical shift if you think of my experience in 2003, and then last Saturday, sitting in Silla's house reading the document, Iceland's Industrial Policy. I thought that that really does encapsulate a very big change in the content of the window of discourse.
I think even though in this country this term was not often applied, in the past, like even during Jonas Haralds, you mentioned him,
yes.
In the 1960s, the government was attempting to diversify the export sector by exporting energy, not just fish. Mm-hmm. So we got the smelters. So that was a type of industrial policy. Mm-hmm. And then in the 2000s, you could say this banking adventure was a sort of a government business cooperation that ended in disaster. And then Yeah, the tourism was more just spontaneous. But the impetus for this government is that it observes that the productivity had not increased in the past 10 years. So GDP has increased because of an influx of immigrants putting pressure on all the systems we have here, housing, health, and so forth. So the idea was to promote productivity growth in the existing sectors. That's the idea.
And average income is the same today as in 2018.
Yeah. So not to pick winners, but to promote productivity growth across the board. Mm-hmm. That was the idea. So this has existed here before, but
but not encapsulated in anything like a national policy.
No.
Yeah. One question regarding the sort of the time horizon. If you draw on lessons from Asia, I mean, politicians are only elected for 4 years. Yeah. Is this is this doable in a 4-year time span, or how do you envision? I mean, by shutting up, of course, agencies and institutions, you actually can, prolong your influence in those institutions. You have a mandate to do something of this sort.
Yes, with some degree of autonomy, with a board, for example, which is constituted in a way with rules, perhaps similar to that of the central bank. So it's not just buffeted around by who happens to become the minister of something of industry that's named. But the short answer is I don't know. Certainly in Northeast Asia, the planning councils had a great deal of autonomy. But during the fast growth years, of course, the Korea and Taiwan were not democracies. But I agree that is a very important point. And the designers of the Iceland's industrial policy really have to pay attention to that.
Maybe because I was involved in this. So, we did emphasize a lot that the government should include the opposition parties in the whole process to get a consensus. So when there's a new government, it will continue, because this is going to take more than 4 years. Right. But the only problem is the political climate in this country is a bit American type, hostility between the opposition. But that has been emphasized, this, to include the opposition. So when it takes over, it will continue. And your points, the unions and industries and all that were involved in this process.
They were?
Yeah, they were all in days talking to their representatives. And
but is there anything written down about the organization of industrial policy in Iceland? Do you know?
But then there are internal documents. I mean, but wait, and then we did emphasize that there would be measurables.
Yes.
So it wouldn't just be.
Yes.
And for each of these, at least in the internal documents, there are measurables. And this board that I'm on is supposed to meet several times, 4 times a year, in the next 2 to 4 years, to take each measurable. Has this been accomplished or not accomplished? And we put a lot of emphasis on the tools, how to get like the education system. So we're in a university, so they want to increase the emphasis on STEM.
Yeah.
So how can you do that in this institutional context? I mean, because even if you give more money to the STEM departments here, there's a lack of applicants to study the STEM because the secondary schools are not delivering enough students, because the primary schools are not emphasizing STEM. So you have to go all the way, and then there's the idea of attracting foreign students in STEM, because it takes so long to change the system here from primary to secondary. So it was there was a lot of emphasis on how to do things. So I think what our input was about the tools and the measurables and about the education. But the philosophy is to, or the what we're thinking about is increasing productivity growth across the board, not picking winners. So even tourism, which is, we think of a low productivity service sector, to have incentives for tourism to increase productivity. And then we have, this is my last point, we have, as Statistics Iceland, we have firm level data, so we can actually measure productivity by sector. So that I hope will happen, is that there will be measurable output to see what the productivity is doing in each sector in the next few years. So what you're saying is not new, but there's a problem with, of course, politicians being short-sighted to their own tenure, and also, have lofty goals but not tangible things. And we've been trying to get that through.
Okay, well, let me ask you something. Did you go into any kind of detail about how to coordinate the 10 ministries?
Well, the Prime Minister has, that office has these experts that are with 3 people, but everything here is so small. There's 3 people involved in the process that are supposed to make sure that the other ministries, and then this external board should meet periodically to check if each ministry has done what they are supposed to do.
I see.
Tick off.
So these 3 people constitute Iceland's pilot agency or leading agency.
But this is Iceland, only so many of us.
Can I comment to this discussion a little bit to Guðrún's point and also to your point, Gylfi? Got 3 points. The first one is about this, how to ensure continuity of this policy. Because change of government may just brush everything aside and just does something else. Emphasis. I do think, reading these documents, the 2 documents, I do think as a public administration specialist, I do think that this is much more entirely about public administration. The economic arguments are there, and we are now finding a way to get there, to get the outcome of industrial policy. But what I think is this government of this process is beginning at the right point. Seem to me that they are building the legal framework, getting the regulation right, and it is critical for the government to get it through the parliament so as to get a buy-in from opposition. So when it is in legislation, it is more difficult to kind of brush it away. That's one point. The second point I wanted to comment is about how do you get these partners, the organizations listed up in these documents, how do you get them to communicate, come together, and what are the mechanisms that you are using? We have 2 different or 3 different kinds of levels of mechanisms that are different by means of resources. If they are cooperating, it doesn't take very much of resources because they are just sharing information, okay? If we are talking about cooperation, yes, they are dealing with coordination, then you have to put in much more resources. You have to define the sort of delegation and division of tasks and responsibilities. That entails people to speak together and come to an agreement.
That second one is coordination.
Coordination, yes.
Which is more involved,
yes.
More energy intensive, so to speak, than
exactly.
cooperation.
Take much more resources. You have to set up people, and coordination can never be a one-off action. You have to have people who know the mechanism of coordination and what to appeal to and how to build it up. And that is the glue of a network. The third mechanism is the collaboration, and that is a very demanding way to get people to work together, because you have to challenge questions, you really have to, question things and challenge and provoke in order to create something new. And that is also a glue, the third type of glue between the actors. And I don't think, honestly, somebody has to kind of be the leading force of maintaining and implementing these cooperative mechanisms. This was the second point. The third point and the final point is this about the policy tools. And I understand they are setting the legal framework right now with these documents. But What is left to come, and I can see that might be the next step, is to define the policy tools which are necessary to increase or to put in place the right incentives for partners in that by different sectors to participate. Are you going to use competitive grants? Are you going to use state guarantees? Are you going to make contracts? What kind of contract? Is it a competitive contract? Is it a negotiated contract? It depends on the size of the sector. So everything of these 3 points are left to be concentrating on. And the danger of undermining the importance of a leading organization, coordinating, administrating these mechanisms, that could make it vulnerable to kind of being dismissed by new government. These are my points.
But with one last point, I mean, we of course have this tripartisan system where you have, the negotiation between state government and the state and employers unions or employers association and the union. As all the other Nordic countries, I wonder whether in a negotiating strategy between these 3, you can actually run some sort of coalition, if you will.
Is that tripartite system
I
of negotiation well
I'm not
established?
a labor economist here when that is the case, but I mean that's definitely the welfare system and the model that comes from Scandinavia.
Yeah.
To settle things like this in these 3 parts of negotiation.
Is there a well-institutionalized tripartite system of that kind here?
It is to some extent, but I would argue that it lacks many of the ingredients that you find in the Scandinavian countries. For instance, in Norway you have, I think in Sweden and Denmark as well, you have worker representation in the government of the firms. And that makes the commitment that you do in a wage settlement much stronger and deeper than if the workers are suspecting that the firm will just cheat at the first opportunity when you have the signature on the agreement. So this is it's much stronger and much more institutionalized system in the Scandinavian countries, and you have much more structure of how you conduct the bargaining process. Here, the idea is somehow to make a 4-year or 6-year contract or something like that. And that is far too long for a union settlement, in my opinion. Because in 4 or 6 years you have all kinds of asymmetries that have developed where you need to adjust the wages, etc., to reflect that. And by having such a long horizon, it's so many things to solve that the negotiators do not accomplish it. So we need to think more of the microstructure of the negotiation system.
And institutionalize the kind of how are you going to make decisions in this new structure? How are you going to make decisions when you have to implement sort of mechanisms of cooperation or coordination? You have to sort of ensure that this will be institutionalized properly.
Yeah, there is a lack of this institutional. You have some of the elements, but not all of them. On the macro level, you might have it, the unions and the Federation of Employers, they meet and they have their experts, etc. August is one of us that was leaving, one of those experts, So that is not lacking, but this where you make the trust between the negotiating partners, that is maybe lacking, and you make that in, like in worker representation in governance of the firms, then the workers know that if you are going to downsize or whatever you're going to do, you will get something to know about it very well in advance. You will not get it in a staff meeting on a Saturday morning.
Mm-hmm.
But usually trust builds up if partners meet regularly.
Yes, sure.
And then you don't have private, public versus private, you have public and private.
Yeah, and I think that works on all levels.
Wolfie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah,